Español 2, pretérito, verbos irregulares, parte 2. The pretérito, again, is one of the past tenses in Spanish. It's really important to remember that it's just one of the past tenses because next year you will learn another past tense. So it's really important that you remember we're only dealing with one of them. Most verbs are regular, and that's just in general. That's what makes them regular, is that they all follow a pattern. So whether you're talking about the pretérito or any other verb tense, most verbs are going to be regular. For regular verbs, you are going to remember to take the ending off, your AR, ER, or IR, and then to add your endings for the pretérito. Remember, there's one set for AR verbs and one set for ER, IR verbs. We did one set of irregular preterite for last time. Some verbs are irregular, and when you have an irregular verb form, it just has to be memorized. There's nothing around it. What makes a verb irregular is that it doesn't follow the normal pattern. So if it doesn't follow the normal pattern, you have to memorize it. That's just the way it is. There are a few different ways that a verb can be irregular in the pretérito. We already did one type. That's those verbs that are completely irregular. Completely irregular simply means that you don't have any other option than to memorize them. You have the entire verb form that has to be memorized because it's not going to follow any pattern. There are 4 verbs of this type that you are going to have to know: ir, ser, dar, and ver. And the good news is that even though you do have to memorize all of the verb forms, remember that you can memorize them in pairs. Ir and ser are actually exactly the same. They share exactly the same verb chart. And then you have dar and ver that are sister verbs, and remember the only thing that you are changing is your D or your V. So you really only have 2 verb charts to memorize, but it's going to cover 4 verbs. So we are going to do another series of irregular verbs today. And honestly, these are the ones that are the most complicated, so you're going to have to kind of readjust your thinking a little bit to learn these. The second type of irregular verb follows a formula that is different from the regular formula. All right, so these forms do have a formula. That's the good news. But the bad news is you have to remember that the formula is different. You can't just use the regular formula. You will need to know 12 of these verbs that are completely irregular. So the first thing we're going to go through is which verbs they are and also what they mean in the present tense and also in the pretérito. Because if you don't know what they mean, it's really rather useless to talk about how to conjugate them. Andar, conducir, decir, estar, hacer, poder, poner, querer, saber, tener, traer, and venir. All of these verbs should be familiar to you, but in case you've forgotten what a couple of them mean, let's go over that. Andar means to walk, so in the pretérito it would be walked. Conducir, to drive, in the past drove. Decir, to say or to tell, in the past it would be said or told. Estar, to be, and that is was in the past. Now remember that estar is going to be used specifically for changeable types of activities. So we talk about that when we're dealing with things like location or emotions, things that change from time to time. Hacer, to make or do, made or did. Poder, to be able to or can, was able to or could. Poner, to put, is actually the same in the past. It makes things confusing in English. Querer, to want, wanted. Saber, to know, knew. Tener, to have, had. Traer, to bring, brought. And venir, to come, came. Now, if you look at the past of these in English, you may notice that many of these are irregular in English as well. So, walked is not. It is regular in English, has an ED, but drove is irregular, said and told are irregular, was is irregular, made and did are irregular, Was able to, could, irregular. Put, irregular. Wanted is regular, we have the ed. Knew, irregular. Had, irregular. Brought, irregular. Came, irregular. Those are all irregular in English. You can't put an ed on them and make the past tense. So many of the verbs that are irregular in Spanish are also irregular in English, but remember that not all of them. So you do have to know the list in Spanish, and you have to know that they are irregular. So let's talk about conjugation. When you conjugate these verbs, they all have irregular stems. So for these 12 verbs in particular, you can't just take the AR, ER, IR off of them. They actually have a separate stem. You have to memorize it, and that's just the way it is. So let's take a look. Andar is anduve. Conducir, conduh. Decir, di. Estar, estuve. Hacer, is. Poder, pud. Poner, pus. Querer, quis. Saber, sup. Tener, tuve. Traer, tra. Venir, vin. So again, if you look at these, you will notice that we did not just take off the ending and take what's left. You can't do that with these verbs. You have to just know that andar is anduve. The one that I want to point out is hacer and is here, because this is a little bit different. You notice there's an extra form here, and I'll explain why in one of the other slides. In short, it's to keep the pronunciation that we want. We want this is here to sound like s, and we've gone over this before. Remember that in order to sound like s, you have to have ce or ci. So if you have an ending that doesn't start with e or I, you're not going to end up with s, you're going to end up with k, because remember you have ka, ko, ku. So in order to preserve the s sound, there is a form where you have to change that c to z. And you'll see that in a minute when we talk about the endings. Speaking of endings, let's talk about those now. These 12 verbs have their own set of endings. And this is really important, okay? Their own set of endings. You're going to notice that some of these endings look familiar because they are used in other cases. But as a set, they are unique. So you have to remember that this whole set of endings goes along with these 12 particular irregular verbs in the pretérito. For yo, it's a. Tú, iste. Él, ella, usted, o. Nosotros, imos. Vosotros, isteis. Ellos, ellas, ustedes, oyeron. Now, ellos, ellas, ustedes has a special case because we do have some stems that end in J, and it's very unusual to see like J-I-E in Spanish. It just doesn't happen very much. So when you have a stem that ends in J, you are actually going to drop the I, and you're just going to use E-R-O-N for that particular form. And again, just for that form, just when those stems end in J. If you look at this set of endings, you should be noticing that, again, we have no accents at all in the irregular pretérito, all right? You have to be sure that if you're doing the irregulars, whether it's the 4 that we did for this time, ir, ser, dar, and ver, or it's these 12 special formula ones, you are not putting any accents at all in this irregular preterite. So let's do some examples. If I want to say I walked, I'm going to take the verb andar, and I'm going to end up with anduve. You start with anduve because that's the irregular stem, and then a is the ending. You drove would be condujiste. He said, él dijo. She was, él estuvo. Now remember that she was can also be ser. So although I could say ella fue, in this case, I'm telling you just to use these 12 verbs. In real life, you're going to have to determine whether it's she was more of a permanent condition, that's going to be ser, or she was in a place or she was in a certain emotional state, that's going to be estar. You did, usted hizo. Now here is the case where we are going to have this HIZ stem for hacer. I did this example this way on purpose so that I could show you this. Remember that the LE usted ending is O. Because the LE usted ending is O, we can't leave this HIC. If we leave it HIC, it's pronounced ICO. ICO is not what we want. We want it to sound like so. So in order to make it sound like so, we have to change this stem so it is ISO. All right, continuing with our examples. We could, pudimos. You put, using the vosotros, pusistes. They wanted, quisieron. Ellos quisieron. You knew, using ustedes, ustedes supieron. I had, tuve. They brought, trajeron. Now, again, I did this example on purpose so that you could see this specialty. So, normally, the eos ending is I-E-R-O-N. But when you have a stem that ends in J, like the one for traer does, then you have to drop that I and make sure that it's just E-R-O-N. So it's trajeron. We came, vinimos. So you can see this is color-coded. I color-coded it for you. So the green is the stem, that's the irregular. And then that purplish gray is the ending. What you have to remember is that it's this set, only this set of verbs that uses this formula. There are a couple of additional ones that we're not doing right now, but these are the main 12 that use this formula. If it's not in this main 12, or it's not one of the 4 completely irregular we talked about, then it is probably completely regular. So now you're going to go do some Conjugamos practice just with these 12 verbs so that you can get the hang of putting these together. And then we'll do more practice in class.